Welcome to the Media Entrepreneurship Lecture Series, where we invite and welcome the most creative and forward-thinking entrepreneurs. We welcome them to teach us about the role of technology in arts and creation of music and entrepreneurship and the depth and power of such entrepreneurship. And we also welcome them to teach us more about the future of technology. Today we have Mr. John Adcox, who has been in the business of advertising and marketing and new media for 20 years. His clients include UPS, Disney and Coca-Cola. He's also a storyteller with his pilot and his new film coming soon in development along with 2 novels. So ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're ready to indulge in our lecture today and help me welcome Mr. John Adcox.
Thanks, y'all. I'm John Adcox. I'm here to talk about storytelling. These are tools. No matter what medium you're using, there's certain tools that are universal in storytelling. That's what we talk about today. By the way, these are not rules. I'm not one of those people that believes there are no rules in storytelling, because there absolutely are. If you're going to write a police procedural, it's pretty much a given that one of your characters has to be a police officer. There are rules. That's not what this is about. These are just tools. You don't have to use them all. You probably have to use at least some of them. And the reason they're tools is because they work. I'm CEO of a company called Grammarly Media. Grammarly is in the story business. We're a story incubator. We mitigate the risk of original content for books and movies and games in the same way that a business accelerator mitigates the risk of a business startup. Check us out. These are 2 of my favorite quotes in the entire world. The fact is, we're all storytellers. If you're giving a business presentation, you're telling a story. If you're writing a novel, if you're writing a screenplay, that's pretty obvious, you're writing a story. If you're creating a game, if you're creating a VR experience, you're telling a story, at least if you're doing it well. Storytelling is universal, it's a part of who we are, it's how we communicate. The language of God is parable and story. The mediums change. I was looking for an oral storytelling picture. Originally, I was looking for something primal, like with cavemen around a fire. But I found this guy, and I couldn't let it go. And I had to crop it because he's actually surrounded by a whole circle of just traumatized children. But storytelling started out as an oral tradition. I don't think there are many people that still have the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Old Testament memorized. But that's when we got started. We've moved to books, to film, to VR. I don't think any of these mediums really replace the other ones. I think they expand and grow them. I've heard talk about VR someday replacing the movie theater experience. I don't think that's true. I think it's going to enhance it. The story you see on a big screen in the most low-pressure first date imaginable is a story that you'll expand at home with the VR experience. The one that starts in a book goes across multiple media channels. Regardless, the building blocks of those stories are the same. And no matter what they are, they have 3 core elements, always. If you saw the first slide, there's some spoilers there. The first one is, of course, character. The story is to be about someone. There are exceptions. I'm really at a loss to think of one. I guess the movie Koyaanisqatsi, maybe. Did you guys see that? Anybody? Really, it's considerably more than I thought. But it's rare. Just about every story has at least one character, and usually more than one. This isn't rocket science. The story takes place somewhere. Now, milieu is more than setting. We'll talk about that as we go on. It's the whole world of the story, everything that influences the story. And then finally, structure. Spoiler alert, most of this talk is about structure. It's the one that people seem to know least, but it's probably the most important. And fortunately, it's also the easiest to teach. I've seen a lot of novels, manuscripts lately, that start out really strong, that have beautiful sentences, really brilliant 3D characters, but sort of fall apart after the first 100 pages. I think it's because the author didn't have a basic intuitive understanding of structure. By the way, structure is not formula. It's very different. There are a lot of books out there that claim to be about structure. Save the Cat is one. It's a great book, but what it's really about is formula. This is different. We'll start with character. Again, the story has to happen to somebody. In the original Star Wars, Luke Skywalker is the main character. And that's pretty obvious. A main character wants something. That's how stories begin. Luke Skywalker wants to rescue the princess and restore freedom to the galaxy. Now, the other thing that makes a story is there's something that doesn't want the character to have what they want. In Star Wars, of course, that's Darth Vader. It doesn't always have to be another person. The adversity can be, a thing. If your goal is to climb a mountain, the mountain itself is the adversity. But there's always something that's in the way of the character achieving that goal. And by the way, this is true even if your story is a business presentation. The business presentation has a character. By the way, this was the least douchey business picture I could find. And believe me, I looked for a while. There's a lot of elements that build a character. Obviously, visual cues are one. If you see a guy in the fedora hat, a leather jacket, and carrying a whip, it's either Indiana Jones or somebody pretending to be Indiana Jones. You kind of know by the way he dresses that that's Indiana Jones. The other one are actions. The characters are what they do. And the beginning of Raiders of the Lost Ark, the first Indiana Jones movie, you guys saw that? Tells you everything you need to know about Indiana Jones as a character. He's an archaeologist, he's resourceful, he's greedy, he's got a bit of a dark side. He's intellectual, but he doesn't overthink problems. When a boulder's coming, he just turns tail and runs. And then it ends with him being an academic. So in just those few minutes, you've learned everything you need to know for the whole series about who Indiana Jones is. It's really, really great. It's also shallow. Another part of character development is background. Now, we don't have to know everything about a character's background to make the story relevant. We don't have any idea where Rick came from, except that he grew up in certain parts of New York that were tough. We don't know anything about his family life. But what we do know is that before the story opened, he had a very messy breakup. And that breakup has described everything about where he is in the story. You guys have seen Casablanca? Mm-hmm. Good. Everything about Rick comes from that beginning point of that breakup. That's why he's in Casablanca. That's why he's isolated. That's what's driving the story. Another one is subtext. Obviously, what a character does and says tells you a lot about who that character is and what they're feeling, what they're thinking. But what tells us even more is what they're not saying. And the example I have is, I thought about getting the video, but when I downloaded a clip off YouTube, it was in another language. And I don't actually know what that language was. So I'm going to describe the scene. But basically, this is from Crazy Stupid Love. Did anybody see that? I hope. I'm the only one. One of the only two. The movie opens with Julianne Moore's character telling Steve Carell's character that she's having an affair and she wants a divorce. And the movie sort of, picks up from there. It's not the happiest beginning you've ever seen. And Steve Carell's character is absolutely shattered. He keeps talking a lot throughout the entire movie about missing his backyard and how he wants to work on his lawn. And she's not taking care of the lawn properly, the new guy isn't taking care of it at all. He keeps talking about that lawn, and eventually he actually sneaks into his lawn at night when he thinks they're not there and rakes his yard and waters his grass. And of course she comes home, so he's hiding in the bushes, and she sees him with the kids, giving the kids ice cream. And then she goes upstairs, and you can see her through the blinds. Believe it or not, this is not creepy in the movie. But she's up there, and she picks up the call, and of course she thinks she's calling that guy. And his phone rings. So he's picking up the phone, and it's her. And she's saying, hey, I need some help. The water heater stopped working. He said, oh, where are you? She says, I'm down in the basement by the water heater. She's upstairs. He knows that. Okay, do you see a little drawer at the bottom? Yeah, okay, open that drawer and you'll see a little button. I wrote the word push by it. Do you see that? Yeah, I see it, okay. Okay, push that button, and then that's when you put the match in and the light. Oh, it did, thanks. And they keep talking a little bit. Well, if you need anything else, call anytime. I will. And the beauty of this scene is what they're both saying is, I miss our old life and I still love you. Those words are never uttered. But the message comes through much, much more strongly than if they'd used that dialogue. That's character. The other thing is flaws, by the way. every one of those characters has a flaw. I didn't have a picture of a flaw, because I think that kind of came through. Indiana Jones has his dark side. Sorry, I shouldn't have done builds. Indiana Jones has his greed. He's not that different from the villain, and he changes over the course of the movie. That's important. Rick is broken, bitter, and selfish. He's very flawed. He changes over the course of the movie. Julianne Moore is selfish. She changes. Steve Carell is broken. He changes. That's important. Because the main character is not always who you think it is. If you guys have seen Mary Poppins, I'm going to go out on a limb and assume most of you have seen Mary Poppins. This is one of the most famous examples out there. Mary Poppins is not the main character in Mary Poppins. Mary Poppins is a static character. She's an instrument of change, but she's not the one who changes. The main character is the one who changes. In Mary Poppins, it's Mr. Banks. He's the one who doesn't have his relationship with his kids. He's the one who's broken. He's the one who's changed by everything Mary Poppins does in that movie. That is always the case. The main character changes. Usually. There are exceptions. For example, a lot of times the main character is static. Wile E. Coyote is never going to change. He's always going to buy from Acme. It's never going to work. Batman doesn't change significantly. By the way, am I the only one who thinks it looks like Batman is peeing in that picture? Yeah, I probably should have checked that before. Also, sometimes the main character not only doesn't change, but the story hinges upon the character's inability to change. Some great examples. The picture of Dorian Gray literally doesn't change. Tries to change at the end, but it's too late. Hamlet tries to change too late. Another great example is Captain Ahab. And by the way, if you haven't read these, it's really worth the trouble. I recommend it. Anybody in Greek tragedy doesn't change. The next part is milieu. Now, obviously, that's a place where the story happens, the setting. The bar at Cheers is the milieu for the show Cheers. And it's more than just a place where the story happens, although it's the brilliant setup for story. How many jokes can you think of that begins with somebody and somebody walks into a bar, right? Every time somebody comes in that door, it's a story. But the bar was actually a character in the story, in a strange sort of way. And in the last episode, Sam Malone realizes that the love of his life is the bar. It's not Diane, it's the bar. The place should also shape the story in a very significant way. The Starship Enterprise is the setting for Star Trek. Now, Gene Roddenberry famously pitched Star Trek as Wagon Train to the Stars. Without the Enterprise, it's just Wagon Train, not science fiction. But it's more than the Enterprise. There's a whole world that exists around the Enterprise. There's the Klingons and the Romulans and the Federation, all the races with their different history and classes. All of that combines to make a story in a way that a character combines to make a story. It's very important. And in some cases, the place shapes the character. Without the place, the character makes no sense. If any of you have ever seen Tarzan Takes Manhattan, it's absolutely insane. When you take Tarzan out of the jungle, the character just doesn't work. That's so much a part of what the character means and is. There are exceptions to that, of course. I mean, Sherlock Holmes has been modernized and taken out of foggy London a lot. But by and large, the milieu is part of what makes the story work. Imagine Wuthering Heights without the Moors. Can you imagine that story happening in the Bahamas? And then finally, structure. Most of this talk is about structure. It's really important. Most of our idea of structure comes from Aristotle, but Aristotle didn't invent it. He just sort of realized it. And if you go back and look at everything from Greek drama to modern movies to old folk tales, I mean, the Anansi and Spider-Man tales from Africa really capture this 3-act structure really, really brilliantly. And you'll hear about the 3-act structure a lot. I think it's a lie. I don't think there's such a thing as a 3-act structure, but we'll get to that. Aristotle did a chart that looked like this. It was not a very elaborate chart. It was basically a timeline. The story starts and carries on for a while. Yeah, Aristotle's famous for that. We had to start somewhere. They also added a dot. This dot is important, and he called it the reversal or the recognition. This is when the story is going a certain way, and then about 25% before the end, something happens. There's a realization or a turn in the story that turns the story toward an inevitable end. Like, oh my gosh, that was my mom. That's a realization. We'll go into that a little bit more. Now, that was pretty much our understanding of structure until the Renaissance, when Lope de Vega added another dot. It's also about 25% of the way in from the beginning. And this was the beginning of what we now know as the 3-act structure. In Act 1, you're basically making the case, as he calls it. This is where you're setting up the story, the world of the story, the character of the story, and the potential for conflict. In Act 2, which you'll notice is much bigger than Acts 1 and 2, than Acts 1 and 3, is inevitable conflict. This is where most of the action takes place. And then finally, Act 3, resolve the case. So basically, you have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Seems pretty basic, right? And this has been basically our structure to this day. Sid Field wrote a book called Screenplay that tackles this down for screenplays. That's why it's called Screenplay. But it works for novels and other things too. Gustav Freytag added another dot and a second axis. The dot, the axis is here. We have time. This axis is different. That is tension. The other dot he added is here. And this is important because that means the story ends. But the world of the story continues afterwards. This was before we were setting up sequels, but the idea that the world doesn't end when the story ends. This is our classic 3-act structure. According to Freytag's axis, tension is rising at the beginning of Act 2. Tension keeps rising, until you get to plot point 2, the reversal, and then the tension is slowly resolved. So what's tension? There's actually a formula for it. That's my formula. More specifically, hope versus fear equals tension. We have a hope for a character, and we have a fear for a character. We hope that Luke Skywalker will blow up the Death Star. We're afraid that he'll die. That's tension, and that's what makes story work. So, in Act 1, we introduce the world. In Act 2, the tension rises, and it resolves. Sid Field in Screenplay points out that this is what he calls plot point 1. There's a moment at the beginning of the story where something turns it. You have this world you've introduced, and something turns it into a story. In Casablanca, it's when Elsa re-enters Rick's life. In Star Wars, well, we'll get to that. I'm going to walk you through Star Wars point by plot point. The second plot point is our good old reversal at the very end. And this turns the story toward its inevitable conclusion. And if you watch a movie with a watch on, which will really irritate your date, I can tell you from experience. The first time I figured this out, I had just had a class here at Georgia State on screenwriting. And went to see a movie called No Way Out, I think. It was a Kevin Costner movie about a spy. I think I have the name right. Anyway, spoiler alert. I was watching my watch and realized it was time for plot point 2. And I said, oh, he's the spy, isn't he? And she just looked at me, how do you know? Then after she was asking, were you bored because you were looking at your watch? I said, no, I was watching for structure. And sure enough, that was when the plot point hit. And almost without exception, I really can't think of a counterexample. The tighter the movie is, the more tense it is, the stronger it is, the more tightly it adheres to the structure. This is classic 3-act structure. Now, I think this is wrong, but this is the classic. Again, this is about 30 minutes of film time. And Act 3 is also 30 minutes of screen time. So if you're doing a 2-hour movie, that means the middle act is a full hour. That's a little out of proportion. If you're doing a novel, this also works, by the way. If you're doing, say, a 100,000-word novel, it's a bit on the long side, but pretty standard. The first 250,000 words are your first act, and so on. 50,000 words make up your middle act. If you're doing a business presentation, it works there too. We had to do the 4-minute pitch when we were at Flashpoint, and the first minute was our, 2 slides basically. It works there too. Now there's another part of this act structure, and that is here. This is what we call the midpoint, because it happens in the middle. And if you watch a movie, it works exactly like a plot point. I have no idea why this is not considered a plot point. In fact, a lot of drama writing and screenwriting books will call this Act 2A and Act 2B. They're so intent on keeping it a 4-act structure that they add these sort of middle labels. And frankly, if you're looking at just the action or the events of the story, that's fine, it works. But if you're looking a little bit deeper, it does need to be a 4-act structure. Here we have 4 acts that are more or less equal. And the reason for this is because the 4-act structure doesn't focus on the external events of the story. It focuses on the character. Because the events are changing, the story's moving in a direction, the events are happening toward a conclusion, the tension's rising, but the character's changing. In Act 1, and this is almost universally true, your character is in some way an orphan. I'll walk you through Star Wars in a bit, but if you think about the beginning of Casablanca, Rick Blaine is completely isolated from the world. He's living by himself. He has no true friends. He has acquaintances. But he's made himself an orphan. Harry Potter's an orphan, literally, at the beginning of the Harry Potter stories. In the second act, the character is a wanderer, and then a warrior, and a martyr. I'm going to walk you through a movie to show you all these steps and how they work. This is Act 1, The Orphan. And I'm going to use Star Wars as my example. Again, it's 15 minutes, or about 12,000 words. And by the way, if you are writing a screenplay and you're thinking 120 pages is kind of intimidating, that's a lot of writing, think of it as 15 pages. And suddenly it starts getting a lot more manageable. So in Star Wars, in the first 15 minutes, we have our main character, Luke Skywalker, who is an orphan. He's living with his aunt and uncle. He wants to escape the planet. And he meets R2 and 3PO, who basically send him, starts the story going, if you will. He then meets Obi-Wan Kenobi, who tells him about his own past to a degree, and shows him that there's a wider world out there that he can be a part of. Although Luke resists that. He wants to go with him. He wants to have those adventures. But he's stuck. Until we get to the end, plot point 1, when Luke finds out that his aunt and uncle have been murdered. And he says, I want to go with you. I want to learn about the Force and become a Jedi like my father. At that point, Act 1 is over. Luke is no longer an orphan. He's a wanderer. And again, this 15 minutes has its own sort of little story, right? In Star Wars, it starts with R2 and 3PO escaping the space battle, wandering through the desert, and we hope they'll escape and find someplace safe, and we're afraid they'll get blown up and captured by the Empire. That's 15 minutes. The next 15 minutes is all about Luke wanting to leave the area where he's stuck. We hope he'll escape and go have adventures and become a pilot, all the stuff he wants to do. We're afraid he's going to be fixing moisture evaporators for the rest of his life. It's a little bit of tension there. Each one of these is a separate little story. This actually comes sort of by accident. Back in the old days of film, films were delivered on reels. And before they had the 2 projector system, they would have to change the reel. So there'd be like a little mini story on each reel to keep the audience engaged while they took time to change the reel and start the next part of the story. So you wouldn't hear back then, well, we have a problem in the second act, we have a problem in the third reel. Now the second act is Luke's a wanderer. He's not driving the action, he's following Obi-Wan. He goes to his first threshold, this bar. He meets his first helper, Han Solo. He's still not driving it. They escape Tatooine and wind up on the Death Star. Obi-Wan Kenobi goes to turn off the tractor beam, and then suddenly we get to the midpoint, and Luke realizes that Princess Leia is on the space station. Suddenly Luke's character changes, because now Luke is making decisions. He's a warrior. He says, we've got to go rescue her. Han Solo says, no, the old man wants us to wait right here. Luke takes charge. Luke drives the story at this point. He's now a warrior. He's changed. He goes to rescue Princess Leia. It goes kind of well. There's a moment of loss. They have to escape the Death Star and wind up at the Rebel base. This is 2 15-minute little mini movies. It's part of an act. In the 4th act, Luke becomes a martyr. They realize there's one possible chance to destroy the Death Star. It's very risky. And one by one, Luke's support system leaves him. Princess Leia has to stay behind. Han Solo flies off. Obi-Wan has passed away. So Luke is an orphan again. He goes to launch this reckless martyr attack. And one by one, his helpers sort of return. Obi-Wan tells him to use the Force. Han Solo shows back up and says, Yahoo! And everybody gets a medal except for Chewie. That's the structure. We know the story's continuing past the end, and this is even before we saw The Empire Strikes Back. We know that this movie ends with that little after moment after the action, and we've seen the character go through a progressive change. In fact, a good way to identify the main character is to look, do they go through these stages? It can be a dual lead. For example, When Harry Met Sally has 2 lead characters that both go through this sort of arc. They both have to change before the story can resolve. Compare that to Sleepless in Seattle, which is almost the same story, also with Tom Hanks. I'm sorry, no. With Tom Hanks, this one was not. Harry Met Sally was not Tom Hanks. But with Meg Ryan. Meg Ryan in that one is not a main character. She does not change. She is there to facilitate Tom Hanks' character's change. So it's not a dual lead there, even though it's almost the same story with the same structure. The Big Chill has a whole lot of main characters. And it's interesting in The Big Chill because each character sort of has their own arc, but the ensemble as a whole has an arc. It's really tricky to do, but when you can pull it off, it's really amazing. So if you look at a movie this way, it's a lot of little stories that together make up a big story. I'm of the opinion that when somebody has writer's block, they haven't plotted out all of these little points that make the story work. They've gotten to a point where they don't know the story anymore. So if you start working this out early, planning the structure of your story, you're going to write a lot fewer drafts. You're going to finish a lot faster, and your story is going to be a lot tighter and stronger. There are people who write, in writing they call them the pantsers, because they write by the seat of their pants. They have a general direction for the story. Some of them are very successful. Most of the ones I know that write that way write many, many, many drafts before they find the arc and voice of their story. This is a lot like having a blueprint. It can change. By the way, it does kind of like a dinosaur, doesn't it? These are not exactly equal. That was to show that these don't have to fall exactly on specific page counts or minute counts. Also because I was too lazy to measure and make the lines. But the closer you are, the tighter your story is going to be, and the more the audience is going to respond to it. Storytelling has a rhythm, and that rhythm is structure. Structure really makes your story flow. It's the most powerful tool in your toolkit. If you're doing a business presentation, think about this. So I want to leave you with some questions. Who's the main character in your story? Now, if you're doing a business presentation, you're telling your story, your product, to somebody. You think you'd be the main character, right? No. Your customer's the main character in the story. They're the ones who have a problem. They're the ones that are an orphan. They're the ones that are wandering. Your product gives them the strength, the ability to be a warrior. Always focus your presentation on changing the customer from an orphan or somebody broken to somebody who has a solution. What makes that character utterly unique and memorable? Think of Indiana Jones. He's got the costume and the actions. That's shallow. He's also, we realize, he's got a dark side over time. He's got a past. He's got wounds. Those make Indiana Jones a much more interesting character. We learn that as the film progresses. It's a great place to start with the action, but you'll want to deepen it. Show us his flaws and his background. What does the main character want? Indiana Jones wants to find the lost ark. Rick Blaine wants to stop hurting, find a place. Who or what is the adversary? In a business presentation, this is what's keeping the customer from being the most authentic self. At Flashpoint, we hear a lot about the job to be done. If you're making widgets and the widgets have to be painted red, and the customer's having a problem getting them red, that's a job to be done. Your job is to convince them to hire you to do that job. What's the milieu? In a business presentation, what's the environment out there that the customer's facing? In a story, what's shaping it? Indiana Jones is set, by and large, during World War II. All of that influences the shape of the story. In modern times, it's kind of hard to believe that he's going to find a lost tomb in the jungle in the era of Google Earth. But we can kind of believe it in World War II. That texture makes Indiana Jones work. It's part of the story. Star Wars, not set in space, is just the hidden fortress. Milieu shapes the story, it's important. And then finally, how is your character an orphan, a wanderer, a warrior, a martyr? In other words, how do they change over the course of your story? Again, these aren't rules, these are tools. I think that they work. I'm at a loss to think of really strong examples of story that work without using most of these tools. I'd love to find out what you think. Thanks for your time. By the way, that's our URL. Please check out Grammar if you have a chance. Thank you very much.
Okay, time for questions.
So, in a storytelling sense, how do you alleviate the audience's expectation of plot armor, where the main character is never truly in any danger, despite being in dangerous situations?
Wow, that's a hard one. Up the stakes. I think a large part of it is giving them something that they care about really, really strongly, and putting that in danger more than the actual character. Are you talking about a static character that's like a James Bond that's always going to be in the next movie?
Any sort of character, dynamic or static.
Yeah, it's really hard. There's not a formula answer for that. It's going to change for every story, in my opinion. One of the strongest ways I know to do it is to give the main character everything they want and then take it away. The show Buffy the Vampire Slayer did that really, really beautifully in one of the crossover episodes where Buffy finally got her fondest wish and had to sacrifice it to save the world and didn't even get to keep the memory of it. And it was very sad and very poignant. And we knew that Buffy was going to be in the next episode. We knew that Buffy was going to be basically unchanged. You know, she couldn't lose a leg, she couldn't die. But this wound was going to be with her forever. So that was pretty high stakes, and it worked really well. Indiana Jones, we never really think he's probably going to die, but the other characters around him might. He might be wounded. He might fail in his mission. Indiana Jones, I think the great tragedy of Indiana Jones, especially the first one, is that it's an war story, and that he doesn't really affect anything. He's sort of a passenger in the story, and you realize the story would have ended the same way if he hadn't participated. So he's sort of a helpless witness, and that's a danger for Indiana Jones. I think it's going to change every story, though. That's your job, is to, the old cliche is chase your character up a tree, light the tree on fire, and then throw rocks at them. Do that. Is there somebody else?
Did you design the 4X structure?
No, I've adapted it and stolen it from a lot of different sources. I think this version of it is unique, but I'm not sure. It's really not rocket science, because if you look at, there is a midpoint, it acts just like a plot point, it turns the story exactly the way a plot point does. But what's really changing at that point is not the texture of the story, but the texture of the character. So I don't know how much of it's unique. I really don't remember. Sorry, it's not a great answer.
No.
Yeah.
So how could you effectively apply these elements to like music videos and or commercials or short films where you have less time to kind of go through these different phases? How could you convey that message as a whole?
Well, 30-second commercial you can still divide by 4, so that's 15 seconds and then 14 and a half, or 7.5 seconds. Pardon, my math is not great.
But just shorten the time.
Not every commercial tells a story, but the ones you remember to kind of do. The ones you say, oh, I saw this great commercial last night. There was one commercial that was so great it was done 3 times by 3 different ad agencies for 3 different cars. It was about basically somebody driving fast to get to a wedding. You think it's his wedding, breaking in and realizing he's there to stop the wedding, and then driving away with the girl. That's 4 steps. It's character, and it was copy. It was hilarious that 3 different agencies coincidentally in the same basic ad structure. You don't have to use every tool in toolbox. I think most commercials have a character. Somebody's got a problem that the product is meant to solve. There's a world around them. There's a milieu. And that character changes from broken to unbroken by the directorial figure.
Right.
I didn't say it's a great story. Yeah.
With nonfiction storytellers, like documentary or something like that, and they're trying to find what the story or their subject is, do you think that they're going to be looking for the same act structure type of thing?
In my opinion, yes. I'd actually have to sit down and go through a couple of documentaries and watch them structurally and time them out. I think documentaries have structure. I really haven't looked at one specifically. I'm at a loss to think of one that doesn't have some kind of structure. Ryan Green, the physicist, talks a lot about structuring his papers and books like a novel. So that's one example, but I'd have to sit down and go through them. It'd be a fun exercise, though. I recommend it. Be a great paper for somebody.
They need to come up with money.
There you go. I'd like to read it if you do. Yeah.
When you break down your story before you start writing, do you do beats within all of the structures, all of the acts? That's one thing.
I'm mean to. I start by doing that. I basically do the 4 acts first, the main parts. There was a screenplay I was working on, the Eden story that I was really careful. I plotted out the first act shot by shot, beat by beat by beat. And then I thought, well, I want to be sure this is working, so I'm going to just write a few pages to be sure that I'm getting my beats at the right pace, and of course finish the screenplay, because at that point I knew the story so well. But that was just me getting lazy. I had to do more revisions on the second act than the first, by far. The second act was a little bit bloated for that reason, so I should have. But I don't always. I'd be better off if I did. I'd be better off if I ate more vegetables. So,
Could you give an example of the martyr in like a business setting, like where somebody using that structure for a business presentation? Who's the martyr? What's the martyr? It's not clear.
yeah, it's basically you're asking to take a leap of faith, a risk, if you will. Martyr may be a little bit too liberal, where I should probably come up with a better one. It works really well in dramatic storytelling. We can solve this problem for you. Invest in us, because we're asking you to risk your hard-earned money. The leap of faith, but you're also asking them to believe in the reward. So take the leap of faith for the reward is sort of a more that works in that. to my mind.
So, it was interesting to me that you talked about when in a business presentation, the customer is, really your character. And I'm wondering where audience fits into your 1, 2, and 3. Is 4 audience? So you have character and you have, milieu and you have structure. Where does audience fit?
I hadn't really thought of, when you're crafting a story, you're not always crafting it for a specific audience. So these aren't all the tools.
Right.
If you're writing for a specific audience, our grammar pitch was written for investors, so obviously I thought about investors.
Right.
But in that sense, I was thinking them as the character, not as the audience. Our grammar selection criteria involves looking for specific audience types that congregate immigrants so we can reach them effectively. But I don't really think that anybody's writing their story with that in mind, at least I hope not.
Well, so, see, that's, I really am trying to square this. It's actually, to me, really complicated, because students who are trying to think of businesses that are around creative industries have to know who their audience is, and they have to resonate, but they also have to create art, and it's complicated.
It is. I can't really think of a writer that isn't writing. They're probably either writing for people like themselves, or people they know, or communities they know.
I like the
That's novels, though.
Yeah.
With business, it's very specific. It's in that point, it gets hard to break down the idea of character and audience, because so much of what you're trying to do is create empathy between the two, and empathy by definition is two-way. So you're thinking about it when you're crafting all of these things. I guess you could say all of them are for audience. Structure holds the audience's attention.
Yeah.
Tension holds the audience's attention. Character makes the audience care.
So what we talk about is the end user experience, and so I think that's actually good, because the tension and the hope is the experience that the person is, that your audience is feeling. So maybe the whole thing is about audience.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, everything, all these tools are meant to create emotion, response in an audience. So I guess it's not one set that's a tool, it's that they're all tools that connect and engage an audience. Does anybody disagree with it? Anybody have thoughts? Sorry.
No, I'm glad that conversation come up, because as a writer, we taught like in film classes and different other media classes that, like even like one of the topics was Disney, and Disney they have a brand. They want you to write a story based on whatever that medium is, and you have to appeal to a certain crowd so they can make a theme park of it, make a toy out of it, and that. So we're always taught, and this is going back, with years of having school, we're always taught a certain way of doing something, and then later on it's like, oh yeah, be creative, but don't be too creative, So it's kind of like it's that jump rope, that thin line right there. So it's just kind of like, it's refreshing to hear you say, this is, you still can be creative, and these are not like a set rule or a set guideline to, storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, for Grammarly, using us as an example, we have a checklist of content, of what we're looking for in content, and there's 50 points on that checklist, 47, I think. That's a lot of them. It's very specific and very narrow, but we're looking specifically for content that we can start as a book, graduate to film, graduate to merchandise, graduate to AR, VR, all as part of a continual process, with the core storyteller, the writer, driving that process as an entrepreneur. There aren't a lot of books that fit it. I don't know if you could sit down and try to write to that checklist, or if something you've written happens to fit it. I mean, I think there's a lot of different holes out there with different shapes. Your choice is either find the right hole that fits your peg or shape your peg. There's really not a third option. I think it's hard to say that one of them has more purity than the other, because I don't think it's true. It's like you have to write a haiku poem. So you've got a certain number of syllables and lines, but within that you can do anything. So yeah, there's a Disney formula and a Pixar formula, but you can do amazing things with it. don't think you have to put rubber bands on your creativity just to fit a formula.